The ashes of Dunrobin. The town of Dunrobin wasn't always as it appeared in the photos, the ruins of a once thriving community, now little more than burnt skeletons and memories. Before the fire, there were stories, whispers of something wrong, a curse that had clung to the town for generations. But, like most things, it was a story that people didn't want to believe until they had no choice. It started with the fire, of course. No one could explain how it began, just that it was sudden, fierce, and unrelenting. By the time the flames died, nearly everything was gone. The old church, the one with the tall spire that had watched over the town for centuries, was little more than a charred skeleton. The houses, the shops, the school, all reduced to ash. But what remained, in the wake of that fire, was something darker. Something the survivors would never speak of, not even to each other. They didn't need to. They all knew. Tourists arrived soon after, drawn by the stories of the fire and the allure of the ruins. It had become a place of interest and attraction. People came in droves, snapping selfies in front of the church spire, the charred remnants standing tall against the sky like a monument to the past. They didn't know what the town's ashes really held. They didn't know what was buried beneath the soot. It was the scavengers that learned too late. People, desperate for a piece of the past, sifted through the ashes, old coins, buttons, rusted jewelry, anything they could find to take home as a reminder of the fire. They didn't know that in doing so, they were disturbing something far older than the fire. The first whisper came late at night. A soft voice, too faint to be heard clearly, but enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, swirling in the wind like a memory you couldn't quite reach. The lucky ones heard it and dismissed it, shivering as they told themselves it was just the wind. But the unlucky ones, the ones who lingered too long in the ruins, who tried to claim too much of the town's broken pieces, they didn't just hear the whispers. They vanished. It started with Greg Harper, a local man who thought he'd found something valuable beneath the ruins. He was one of the first to notice that there was something wrong with the ashes, something that made the air taste sour, thick with the smell of something burning even days after the fire had passed. Greg was a collector, a man who saw value in the old things people abandoned. He pulled up a rusted pocket watch from the ashes and thought it was his lucky day. But that night, Greg didn't return home. His wife, Claire, found only the faintest traces of him, the burnt odor that lingered in the air, the pocket watch on the doorstep. When the police searched, there was no sign of struggle, no footprints in the dirt, no trace of Greg at all. His disappearance was chalked up as another unfortunate side effect of the tragedy, but in Dunrobin, they all knew better. The curse was real, and it didn't care who you were or what you had found. Days turned into weeks, and more people came to sift through the wreckage. They were met with the same whispers, the same unease in the air. Some, like Greg, vanished entirely. Others heard the whispers but couldn't ignore the urge to return, to see what more they could find, to try to grab something, anything, that would make them feel like they had found a piece of Dunrobin they could take with them. But each time they came back different. The once vibrant eyes of the town's visitors grew dull and haunted. They didn't speak much, and when they did, it was often in half sentences that didn't make sense, words lost in the static of their minds. They would tell stories of what they'd seen, the strange flicker of shapes in the ruins, shadows that moved on their own. But the words felt empty, hollow. And then there were those who returned with nothing at all. They didn't vanish in the same way as Greg, they simply disappeared, leaving no sign of where they had gone. Their absence was more of a presence than anything. A heavy, suffocating weight that settled over the town, a constant reminder that whatever had cursed Dunrobin wasn't finished yet. The whispers grew louder in the nights that followed. People claimed they could hear voices, strange murmurs like the voices of the missing. Some said they were warning others to leave, to stop digging in the ashes. But the temptation was too strong. The curse was an unrelenting thing, feeding on curiosity, greed, and the need to understand what had been lost. As time passed, Dunrobin became a place of silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful, it was the kind that pressed in on you, making you feel as if you were being watched. Those who had stayed left eventually, their faces drawn and their minds shattered by the things they had seen. The town was abandoned, the fire's aftermath lingering as an unhealed wound. But the ruins remained, with the church spire still standing tall above the ashes, its shadow stretching over the land like a warning. And in the wind, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear the whispers. If you were lucky, they might just be the wind. But if you were unlucky, you might hear your own name spoken from somewhere deep within the ashes. The sound beneath the tracks. Freeman had always loved trains. As a kid, he'd sit by the tracks for hours, listening to the distant whistle, feeling the rumble of the passing trains deep in his chest. It was a soothing sound, one that made him feel connected to something bigger, something constant. But that all changed one summer evening, when he stood too close to the platform edge. He'd been waiting for the 6:15, the usual train he'd take home after work. The night air was warm, the kind of warmth that made the breeze feel like a whisper. As the train neared, he took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the glowing headlights, hypnotized by the rhythm of the approaching roar. Then it happened. For a split second, the train veered slightly off course, its wheels screeching against the track in a sharp, unnerving way. The sound was jarring, like the grinding of metal on metal, the kind of noise that shouldn't exist. He stepped back, heart pounding, but the damage was done. The noise lingered in his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to shake the day's events from his mind, the sound returned. Low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It was so clear, so real. At first, Freeman thought it was just the after effects of the day, a trick of the mind. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more insistent. He sat up, his pulse quickening. The sound was coming from beneath him, under the floorboards, maybe. He sprang from the bed and checked under the mattress, but found nothing. He opened the closet door, rifling through the old coats and shoes, but still, nothing. The sound didn't stop. It was in his head. No matter where he went, no matter how many doors he closed or lights he flicked on, the sound of metal grinding against metal followed him. Every night, it grew louder, until it was all he could hear, louder than his own thoughts. Freeman tried everything to get rid of it, sleeping pills, noise-canceling headphones, even visiting a doctor who thought he was just stressed. But nothing worked. The sound grew louder, more frantic. And as the weeks passed, Freeman started to see things. Shadows in the corner of his vision, fleeting glimpses of trains speeding through dark tunnels, their wheels grinding against the track, faster and faster. One night, he woke up to the sound, louder than ever. He could feel the vibration of the train in his bones. The air was thick with it. The noise was no longer in his head. It was in his room. And it was coming closer. Freeman's heart raced as the noise filled every corner of the room, suffocating him. He stood frozen, staring at the shadows in the doorway, waiting for the train to come. But it never did. And yet, the sound remained. The Devil's Attic. The Harlow family thought they'd found a bargain when they bought the old mansion on Blackthorn Road. It was cheap, much cheaper than anything else they'd looked at, and the house had a certain charm, though that charm came with peeling paint, cracked windows, and floors that creaked like ghosts were walking across them. Still, the Harlows weren't picky. They'd been looking for a fresh start, and the mansion seemed perfect. It had enough space for their growing family, a wide yard for the kids to run around in, and the price was too good to pass up. The realtor had warned them about the house's history, but they brushed it off. Old houses always had stories attached to them, didn't they? But the stories weren't the problem. The problem began with the attic. It was small, hidden behind a narrow door on the third floor, which had clearly never been used for anything but storing old junk. Mrs. Harlow noticed the door immediately. It was heavy, old-fashioned, and for some reason, it never quite stayed shut. Each time they passed it, the door would be cracked open just a little bit more, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. At first, it was nothing. Just an old house being what it was, drafty, creaky, and full of forgotten memories. But one night, after the kids were asleep and the house fell into a strange, heavy silence, something changed. The scratching started. It was faint at first, just a soft sound, like the scrape of fingernails on wood. Mrs. Harlow thought it was just the wind, but when she heard it again, she froze. The sound was deliberate, as if someone, was drawing slow, methodical patterns on the other side of the attic door. Her heart beat a little faster. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She couldn't shake the feeling that the scratching was trying to tell her something. A message, or a warning. That night, she asked her husband to go up to the attic and check it out. "Please," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't like it." Her husband, tired from a long day of unpacking, nodded and made his way upstairs. He gave the door a puzzled look but shrugged it off, convinced it was just rats or a squirrel getting stuck in the rafters. He grabbed a broomstick and opened the door. But he didn't find any animals. Instead, he found a dark emptiness, a room that smelled of mildew and decay, its floor covered in dust. He poked around with the broom but didn't find anything strange, nothing to explain the noise. He shook his head and went back to bed, reassuring his wife that everything was fine. But the scratching didn't stop. It got louder over the next few days. It wasn't just random anymore, it was rhythmic, like a claw was tracing patterns on the other side. Some nights, it seemed to speed up, getting more frantic, while other nights, it slowed, as if something was waiting for the perfect moment to break free. Mrs. Harlow didn't sleep much after that. She stayed up, staring at the ceiling, listening to the scratching, hoping it would stop. But it never did. Then, one night, the scratching was louder than it had ever been before. It was as though the thing behind the door was trying to break through, tearing at the wood with desperation. Mrs. Harlow turned to her husband in bed, her voice trembling. "Don't go up there," she said softly. "Please. Something's not right." He nodded, and for the first time, he looked as if he agreed. He lay back down, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the awful sound. But as the hours passed, the scratching seemed to fade into something else, something worse. A slow, slithering noise, like nails against metal. In the morning, Mrs. Harlow woke up to an empty bed. Her husband was gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets twisted, as if he had gotten up in the middle of the night. She searched the house, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The scratching continued. Mrs. Harlow didn't know what had happened to her husband, but she had a terrible feeling. She went up to the attic herself, heart pounding. The door creaked open easily, and as she stepped inside, she found something that made her blood run cold. In the middle of the room, there was a figure standing in the dark. A man, but not her husband. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, and his claws were sharp, stained with old blood. The door slammed shut behind her, and the scratching began again, louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't in her head. It was right behind her. The forgotten ritual. In the sleepy town of Iders Hollow, traditions were like old photographs, faded and often forgotten. The townsfolk had long since abandoned their rituals, dismissing them as quaint relics of a bygone era. But some things, when neglected, have a way of reminding you they're still there. It was late October when the first sign appeared. The scarecrow that had stood in Farmer Thompson's field for years, a patchwork sentinel against the crows, was found standing upright one morning. No one had bothered to burn it the previous fall, as tradition dictated. Now, it stood there, its button eyes gleaming in the early light, a silent accusation. Then came the well. The townspeople hadn't blessed it in the spring, as was customary. By mid-November, the water turned a deep, unsettling red. No one dared to drink from it, and the children whispered that the well was cursed. But it was the altar in the woods that truly unsettled them. Abandoned for years, it had been overtaken by ivy and moss. Yet, one evening, a faint glow emanated from the clearing. When the townsfolk gathered, they found the altar pristine, as if waiting for an offering. The rituals had been forgotten, but the town hadn't been forgotten. And now, the price was being paid. The visitor in room 314. The Roanoke Motel had seen better days. Once a bustling stopover for travelers, it now stood as a relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The staff was small, just Mrs. Jenkins at the front desk and Tom, the night clerk who doubled as the maintenance man. One evening, as the wind howled outside, a man in a gray suit walked through the motel's creaking doors. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes had a hollow look, as if he hadn't slept in days. He approached the front desk, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. "Good evening," Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with a tired smile. "How can I help you?" "I need a room," the man replied, his voice low and raspy. "Room 314, please." Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Room 314 had been vacant for months, its door always locked. But she didn't question him. She handed him the key, noting the coldness of his touch. The man took the key and disappeared down the dimly lit hallway. Mrs. Jenkins watched him go, a shiver running down her spine. Later that night, Tom noticed something odd. The lights in room 314 flickered constantly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He tried to adjust the circuit breaker, but it didn't help. The room remained bathed in an unsettling glow. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins went to check on the guest. She knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Housekeeping," she called out. There was no answer. She knocked again, a bit louder this time. "Sir? Are you there?" Still no response. Growing concerned, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was spotless, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn. But there was no sign of the man. His suitcase was gone, and the bathroom was empty. As she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. On the wall, where the man had been standing, his shadow remained. It was dark and distorted, its edges sharp and unnatural. It stood there, unmoving, as if waiting. Mrs. Jenkins backed out of the room, her heart pounding. She slammed the door shut and ran to the front desk. "Tom," she gasped. "Call the police. Something's wrong with room 314. But when they returned with the authorities, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, the suitcase gone, and the shadow on the wall had vanished. The man in the gray suit was never seen again. And room 314 remained locked, its door never to be opened again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, you can still see the faint outline of a shadow on the wall, waiting. Writing style analysis. Stephen King's writing is known for its simplicity and conversational tone. He often uses straightforward language to create a sense of realism and immediacy. In this story, the use of simple sentences and direct descriptions helps to build tension and immerse the reader in the setting. King also excels at creating relatable characters and placing them in ordinary settings, which makes the supernatural elements more unsettling. By focusing on the mundane aspects of the motel and its staff, the story contrasts the normal with the eerie, enhancing the horror. Additionally, King frequently employs foreshadowing and subtle hints to build suspense. The flickering lights, the coldness of the man's touch, and the locked room all serve as clues that something is amiss, keeping the reader engaged and anticipating the unfolding events. Overall, King's style is characterized by its accessibility, vivid characterizations, and ability to evoke fear through the juxtaposition of the ordinary and the supernatural. The Widow's Bell. In the small town of Millfield, the Roanoke Motel stood as a quiet monument to the past. Its once bright neon sign now flickered weakly, casting a dim glow on the cracked pavement. The rooms were seldom occupied, and the staff was minimal, just Mrs. Jenkins at the front desk and Tom, the night clerk who doubled as the maintenance man. One evening, as the wind howled outside, a man in a gray suit walked through the motel's creaking doors. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes had a hollow look, as if he hadn't slept in days. He approached the front desk, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. "Good evening," Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with a tired smile. "How can I help you?" "I need a room," the man replied, his voice low and raspy. "Room 314, please." Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Room 314 had been vacant for months, its door always locked. But she didn't question him. She handed him the key, noting the coldness of his touch. The man took the key and disappeared down the dimly lit hallway. Mrs. Jenkins watched him go, a shiver running down her spine. Later that night, Tom noticed something odd. The lights in room 314 flickered constantly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He tried to adjust the circuit breaker, but it didn't help. The room remained bathed in an unsettling glow. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins went to check on the guest. She knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Housekeeping," she called out. There was no answer. She knocked again, a bit louder this time. "Sir? Are you there?" Still no response. Growing concerned, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was spotless, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn. But there was no sign of the man. His suitcase was gone, and the bathroom was empty. As she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. On the wall, where the man had been standing, his shadow remained. It was dark and distorted, its edges sharp and unnatural. It stood there, unmoving, as if waiting. Mrs. Jenkins backed out of the room, her heart pounding. She slammed the door shut and ran to the front desk. "Tom," she gasped. "Call the police. Something's wrong with room 314. But when they returned with the authorities, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, the suitcase gone, and the shadow on the wall had vanished. The man in the gray suit was never seen again. And room 314 remained locked, its door never to be opened again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, you can still see the faint outline of a shadow on the wall, waiting. Writing style analysis. Stephen King's writing is known for its simplicity and conversational tone. He often uses straightforward language to create a sense of realism and immediacy. In this story, the use of simple sentences and direct descriptions helps to build tension and immerse the reader in the setting. King also excels at creating relatable characters and placing them in ordinary settings, which makes the supernatural elements more unsettling. By focusing on the mundane aspects of the motel and its staff, the story contrasts the normal with the eerie, enhancing the horror. Additionally, King frequently employs foreshadowing and subtle hints to build suspense. The flickering lights, the coldness of the man's touch, and the locked room all serve as clues that something is amiss, keeping the reader engaged and anticipating the unfolding events. Overall, King's style is characterized by its accessibility, vivid characterizations, and ability to evoke fear through the juxtaposition of the ordinary and the supernatural. The Gravedigger's Lantern. Old Harvey wasn't like the other folks in Mill Hollow. For as long as anyone could remember, he'd been the town's gravedigger, a wiry man with a stooped back and a permanent squint that made his eyes look like two slits in a weathered mask. Most people kept their distance, not because he was mean, but because there was something off about him. The kids whispered stories about Harvey's ancient lantern, the one that burned with a strange, bluish glow. It wasn't the soft golden light of a regular flame, it was cold, like moonlight trapped in glass. Some said the lantern wasn't fueled by oil, but by the souls of the dead. Others said Harvey had made a deal with something that lived in the dark corners of the cemetery, something that didn't care much for the living. Harvey never denied the stories. He didn't talk much at all, except to grunt out a word or two when necessary. He worked at night, his lantern swinging in one hand, his spade in the other, carving fresh resting places for the dead. Then one morning, Harvey was gone. At first, no one noticed. Harvey lived alone in a shack by the cemetery's edge, and he wasn't exactly the kind of man who got visitors. But when a funeral came around, and the grave wasn't dug, people started asking questions. Sheriff McCall went to check on him, found the shack empty, and declared Harvey had moved on. Probably got tired of the quiet, McCall said with a shrug. But then the grave started appearing. It began with Mr. Ellison's funeral. The preacher and the pallbearers arrived to find the ground already dug up, the dirt piled neatly to the side, and a freshly carved headstone at the ready. Harvey must have come back, someone muttered, though no one had seen him. The next grave was dug for young Molly Cartwright, who had succumbed to the fever. Again, the hole was ready before the sun rose, the lantern's eerie glow still fading from the soil. That's when people started asking, if Harvey's gone, who's doing the digging? By the time the third grave appeared, rumors were spreading fast. Mrs. Hensley, the baker, swore she'd seen Harvey's lantern bobbing among the tombstones late at night, its blue light cutting through the mist. Old man Tucker claimed he'd heard the scrape of a shovel and the low hum of a voice, Harvey's voice, he insisted. Could be someone pulling a prank, the sheriff said. But no one believed that. Pranks didn't leave the air smelling of damp earth and something sour, something wrong. Then someone made the mistake of opening one of the new graves. It was Mark Simmons, the town drunk, who dared to pry open the wooden coffin. He claimed he wanted to see if Harvey was hiding his valuables inside. But when the lid came off, Mark screamed and fell back, pale as a ghost. Inside wasn't an empty coffin or stolen trinkets. It was him. Mark Simmons stared down at his own face, pale and lifeless, lips stitched shut with black thread. The body's eyes snapped open, and Mark ran screaming into the night, never to be seen again. From that day forward, no one set foot in the cemetery after dark. People buried their dead in daylight, hurriedly, without prayers or fanfare. But the graves didn't stop appearing. Every few nights, a new one would show up, the lantern's glow still faintly visible, as if it had just finished its work. Finally, a group of men, armed with rifles and lanterns of their own, decided to put an end to it. They marched into the cemetery on a moonless night, determined to catch whatever, or whoever, was behind the madness. They found Harvey. Or at least, they found what was left of him. His twisted body was slumped over the same grave he had dug for himself years ago. The lantern hung from his skeletal fingers, glowing with that unearthly blue light. One of the men reached out to snuff it, but as his hand neared the flame, a voice hissed from the darkness. "Leave the dead to the dead." The lantern flared brighter, blinding them for a moment, and when their vision cleared, Harvey and the lantern were gone. The grave stopped appearing after that, but no one felt safe. People started burying their loved ones in neighboring towns, leaving the cemetery to rot. On quiet nights, though, some swore they could still see a faint blue light flickering among the headstones, moving slowly, as if looking for something or someone. And when the wind blew just right, carrying the scent of damp earth, the town remembered Harvey's warning, "Leave the dead to the dead." The door in the woods. Charlie and his friends had spent countless afternoons exploring the woods behind their neighborhood. They knew every tree, every rock, every hidden path. But today was different. As they approached their usual clearing, they stopped in their tracks. There, standing tall and imposing in the middle of the open space, was a door. No walls. No structure. Just a door. Where did that come from? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Charlie replied, his brow furrowed. "It wasn't here yesterday." The door was old, its wood withered and worn. A tarnished brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight. "Should we open it?" Mark asked, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Charlie hesitated. He felt a strange pull toward the door, an inexplicable urge to see what lay beyond. "Maybe we shouldn't," he said, his voice uncertain. But the others were already egging him on. "Come on, Charlie. Don't be a chicken," Sarah teased. "Yeah, what's the worst that could happen?" Mark added. With a deep breath, Charlie stepped forward and grasped the doorknob. It turned easily in his hand, and the door creaked open. Beyond the door was darkness. A thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow the light. "Charlie, don't!" Sarah cried, but it was too late. Charlie stepped through the door, disappearing into the void. The door slammed shut behind him. The friend stood frozen, staring at the spot where Charlie had vanished. "Charlie?" Mark called, his voice shaking. "Charlie, come back." But there was no answer. They waited, hearts pounding, but the door remained closed. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, and it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she said, panic rising in her voice. They tried everything, pounding on the door, calling Charlie's name, but nothing worked. The door remained shut, as if it had never been there at all. They ran back to the neighborhood, breathless and terrified, and told the adults what had happened. But when they returned to the clearing, the door was gone. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Charlie. His parents searched the woods, the police were called, but he was never found. And then, the whispers started. People began to hear Charlie's voice on the wind, faint and distant, calling their names. At night, they would hear his laughter echoing through the trees, followed by a chilling silence. Some said it was just the wind playing tricks. Others believed the door had taken Charlie to another world, a place where he was trapped forever. But no one knew for sure. And every time the wind howled through the woods, the friends couldn't help but wonder, was Charlie still out there, waiting to be found? Or had he become a part of the darkness beyond the door? Writing style analysis. Stephen King's writing is known for its simplicity and conversational tone. He often uses straightforward language to create a sense of realism and immediacy. In this story, the use of simple sentences and direct descriptions helps to build tension and immerse the reader in the setting. King also excels at creating relatable characters and placing them in ordinary settings, which makes the supernatural elements more unsettling. By focusing on the mundane aspects of the woods and the children's exploration, the story contrasts the normal with the eerie, enhancing the horror. Additionally, King frequently employs foreshadowing and subtle hints to build suspense. The door appearing suddenly, the friends' mixed feelings about opening it, and the eventual disappearance of Charlie all serve as clues that something is amiss, keeping the reader engaged and anticipating the unfolding events. Overall, King's style is characterized by its accessibility, vivid characterizations, and ability to evoke fear through the juxtaposition of the ordinary and the supernatural. The shifting house. Emma had always been certain that her bedroom window faced the old oak tree in the backyard. She'd spent countless nights gazing out at its gnarled branches, watching the wind dance through the leaves. But tonight, something was different. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was unfamiliar, the walls closer than she remembered. The window, once overlooking the backyard, now framed a view of the street outside. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and she could hear the distant hum of traffic. Confused, Emma sat up and rubbed her eyes. Had she sleepwalked? Had someone moved her? But no, everything was as it should be, except for the window. She stood and approached the window, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the empty road. She could see her neighbor's house across the street, the porch light still on. Emma turned away from the window, her mind racing. She needed to get back to her own room. But as she stepped into the hallway, she froze. The walls were different. The paintings she'd hung were gone, replaced by unfamiliar artwork. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but the sound was muffled, as if the house had grown. Panic set in. She rushed to the stairs and descended, but the layout was all wrong. The kitchen, which should have been to the left, was now upstairs. The living room was smaller, the furniture rearranged. Emma stumbled back, her breath shallow. This wasn't her house. It was the same house, but it had changed. It was alive, shifting, rearranging itself. She ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The doorknob turned, but the door remained shut. She pounded on it, shouting for help, but no one answered. Desperation clawed at her. She needed to escape. She needed to find a way out before the house changed again. But as she turned to search for another exit, she heard it, a low, guttural growl from deep within the house. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor beneath her feet vibrating. The house was alive, and it was angry. Emma backed away, her mind racing. She had to find a way out. She had to escape before the house consumed her. But as she turned to flee, the hallway stretched before her, endless and dark. The house had changed again. It was no longer the home she knew. It was a maze, a labyrinth designed to trap her. And in the distance, she could hear the house whispering her name. Writing style analysis. Stephen King's writing is known for its simplicity and conversational tone. He often uses straightforward language to create a sense of realism and immediacy. In this story, the use of simple sentences and direct descriptions helps to build tension and immerse the reader in the setting. King also excels at creating relatable characters and placing them in ordinary settings, which makes the supernatural elements more unsettling. By focusing on the mundane aspects of Emma's home and her growing realization that it is